I feel like Superman, they gon' remember me. I think I know I can. Who says it's hard to reach? Who's gonna stop me on the road to success? I don't know. They try to break me down, but I'm still on my feet. This city's full of life, so why is it hard to breathe? Oh, why did God create this world so unfair? I don't know.
It's lovely to see so many of you here for what is the second event, maybe the third event technically of Wamfest this year, given Stefan. It's wonderful that Michael's going to be drawing us as well. Let's just have one more round of applause before we start coming, because we've been trying to get him here for a couple of years and I'm really glad it's happened. Neil Gaiman. Let's just go back to the beginning for fun.
Okay.
Obviously, your genre.
Before the creation of the earth.
Maybe less far than that.
Okay.
What was you were in the genre of fantasy, whether it be a graphic novel, a novel, a children's book that I've just been looking at, a picture book. What are your early memories of being drawn towards that kind of writing and thought, and what were the books that inspired you when?
The weird thing, of course, about children's fiction is that, like comics, it's a medium that gets mistaken for a genre.
Right.
So, children's fiction is anything that gets published for kids. And I was a reader. I was somebody who, as a kid, I loved books when books were read to me, and it was incredibly important to me to learn how to read so that I was no longer dependent on adults and the goodwill of adults. I could just find these things and take them away. And I read anything. By the time I was 8 or 9, my parents, before any kind of family event, weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals, would frisk me for books. Because there would be a book somewhere, and then they would lock it in the car.
Were they big readers themselves? Was it a reading family?
My dad read, my mum didn't. Although one of the things that I loved as a kid was all her books from when she was a girl, which we inherited, which meant that not only was I reading books from the crop of puffin books that were being published as I was a kid.
Puffin was Junior Penguin in England, and to kids in England, one of the most, I think, recognisable brands. When you were growing up, a Puffin book really meant something.
And everything good was a Puffin book.
Everything.
And so there were authors that I would run into and I would love. Some of them, some famous things like P.L. Travers, the Mary Poppins books, which I thought were bizarre and wonderful. The Wind in the Willows. I was a huge fan of The Wind in the Willows, I think partly because it felt like there were bits of it I didn't understand. And I always liked books I didn't understand. Especially there's a very peculiar chapter in the middle of The Wind in the Willows called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, in which a baby otter gets lost and the great god Pan goes through the wood and somehow they get involved, and it's completely out of character with the sort of social comedy, the rest of The Wind in the Willows.
And also, of course, recognisable to fans of rock music, because Pink Floyd named an album after it, which is incredibly influential on psychedelia, which It's a shocking link with Wind in the Willows, really.
The Wind in the Willows.
Yeah.
And also I loved weird things in the Wind in the Willows, like the fact that you couldn't figure out how big the animals were.
Right. Tricky.
Because they were, at some points, you had a toad-sized toad, but then you had a toad-sized toad who could drive a car. And disguise himself as a washerwoman to escape from prison. Well, what size is this toad?
He just hadn't thought it out, had he?
I like to think that he had thought it out, but had gone, sod it. This is my book. And the weirdest thing about The Wind in the Willows, as with quite a few childhood classics, is it didn't come out as a classic and was not actually highly regarded and rapidly went out of print. You know, it came out and published about, I think, 1911, something like that, and was met with deafening silence. And finally, in the mid-20s, late 20s, A.A. Milne, who is famous to us as the creator of Winnie the Pooh, but at that time was most famous for being a contributor to Punch magazine and for being a very powerful and popular West End playwright. And A. Milne wrote an article that was published in Punch that was a plea for people to read The Wind in the Willows, and nobody did. So he then got the rights to The Wind in the Willows and wrote a play called Toad of Toad Hall. And that, put that on the West End, that became popular, and that then became the thing that made The Wind in the Willows famous.
That's very interesting, isn't it?
But so I read my mum's books. When I went to school, I remember being about 9 years old at a strange old little English prep school, and what was great was I knew exactly when this school had had money for the library. They'd had a little bit of money in about 1895,
Right.
and then round about 1920, they got a brief cash infusion and had all the Edgar Wallace they could find and a whole lot of other stuff. And then they were obviously broke through the war years, but around about 1953 they got a load more. So I was the kind of kid who would simply read his way through the library. So rapidly gained a working knowledge of Edwardian thrillers, which I assumed everybody had.
Yeah.
You know, it's that thing where you suddenly realize when you're in your 20s that nobody else has read these books that you've read unless they're actually at universities and specialising in the subject.
Well, I think prep school libraries are legendary for that kind of thing. I have an amazing acquaintance with the work of G.A. Henty. Almost, I'm sure, completely unread by everybody in this room, but also pretty much everybody my age group too, except, you know, people who went around my school library.
And Henty is a perfect example. He was writing these strange historical novels that were of another time, and not terribly good. but in the same way that, thinking of there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, in the same way that Captain W.E. Johns, who wrote the Biggles books, which
Again,
you never heard of.
Yeah.
Many years later, the fact that Americans did not know what the Biggles books were. And
The Biggles books were quite good.
They became incredibly useful in my life, just for one moment once. Biggles was a series of books by Captain W.E. Johns about a World War I flying officer named Captain Bigglesworth, who his friends Ginger and Algie also called Biggles. And
It's not funny yet.
he also wrote the Worrells series for girls and the less popular Gimlet series. There you go. So back in about 1990, Terry Pratchett and I went out to Hollywood for our very first meeting about a book we'd written together called Good Omens. And it had just been bought by Hollywood. And so we're about to go up for the very first meeting. And Terry looks at me and he says, what if this is terrible? What if it all goes wrong? What if these people are so bad that we need to head for the airport? We just need to get out. We leave the meeting together. We need a code word. And I said, well, whatever the code word is, it has to be something we're not going to say accidentally. You know, just in conversation. I'm not going to say, yes, I think this will be a perfect moment for poached eggs, and then Terry and I just get up. It has to be something that we cannot say unintentionally, and it needs to be something that Americans don't know what it is. So I said, well, what about Biggles? Nobody is going to say Biggles accidentally. And Terry says, okay, Biggles it is, World War I flying officer, Biggles. And we go up to the meeting, and the door opens, and a lady comes in who was the head of that studio, and she starts talking about our book. And she's sort of saying, now, what we see it, the way that we see it is we've got this witch finder, and then we've got the, he's going to be like Tom Cruise, the witch, she's going to be pretty beautiful. The kid in your book, he's like 11. We figure we make him 17, 18, so he's got the hots for the witch, but he really admires the witch finder. And it's this trio that is going to propel this story. And I look at Terry, and he's going like this.
And also, if anybody's interested in finding out more about Biggles, there is a fantastic sketch by Michael Palin.
Yes, Biggles Flies Undone.
Biggles Flies Undone. The one I remember is Biggles buys a Bruce Springsteen ticket, which is really good too.
That was the sequel. Because the book's all called Biggles Flies Again, Biggles Flies South, Biggles Flies South.
It's terrible that we know this.
It's the shared cultural detritus.
Yeah, well,
it's somewhere in the back of our heads, all this stuff is composting down and we will turn it into art.
Let's momentarily focus on something they'll know what we're talking about. So tell us, when did fantasy kind of take off for you, both through the books you were reading and then the things you might have thought of writing? Because if you're like me, you, of course, coming from England, you received no creative writing training whatsoever. There was none on offer unless you went to UEA. It was the only place it could possibly be done when I was a student.
And I was even weirder, because I was not just obsessed with writing, but I wanted to do comics, which meant there was nowhere. There was the School of Visual Arts in New York actually offered a comics course, and I said to my dad I could go to New York, and he said you could buggery. And that ended that one. So
can you draw yourself? Can you draw yourself? Can you draw?
Can I, comma myself, comma draw?
Yes.
Yes, not. When I was...
Because it's an interesting thing for a writer back then, when comics is not what's the word, a kind of a literary thing to do, to go, well, I can't draw, but I would like to write the bits in the speech bubbles. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I don't mean to denigrate what you do in any way, but it's an interesting thing. You must have liked comics a lot.
I did, and more than liking comics a lot, I felt that they were an undiscovered territory.
Right.
It was that feeling of going, this is something that I could actually take my machete and head out into the wilderness and do stuff nobody's ever done before, because there's so much stuff nobody's ever done before in comics. And to answer the fantasy question, I did not think, even at my most optimistic, that I was going to be a fantasy writer, which, looking back on it, is very odd. I thought probably I was going to be a hard science fiction writer, like Larry Niven or somebody like that. The fact that I was rubbish at science and showed no actual aptitude for writing hard science fiction, or actually read a lot of hard science fiction, didn't actually seem to faze me when I was... but I just thought, well, I'll be one of them. And I think looking back on it, the main reason I thought maybe I'd be one of them is people like Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, particularly in their books of short stories, would write introductions to the stories that would tell you the circumstances in which they were written. And everything else that I would run across just appeared like magic on the page. I didn't know the circumstances under which Ian Fleming had written the Bond books. I didn't know the circumstances under which Wind in the Willows had been written, or the circumstances under which Tolkien had written Lord of the Rings. He didn't really write about it, but I knew that, Isaac Asimov wrote his first stories working in his mum and dad's sweet shop in Brooklyn.
And you knew that because he wrote that as the introduction?
Exactly. His introduction to short stories, you get these short story collections. People like him, people like Harlan Ellison, Arthur C. Clarke, they all did this strange, very chatty thing, where they would talk about the circumstances, sometimes where they wrote it, sometimes what had inspired it.
Well, why did they do that? To ground it in some kind of reality where you understood they were a human being despite this amazingly otherworldly thing they were trying to...
I think probably it had more to do with partly wanting to have context, partly given the fact that science fiction is always a territory covered with tiny, strange internecine wars that nobody quite understands, trying to set the record straight and score points and to say this is actually the history, because they were writing, you had a history of a genre that nobody was interested in writing, so if they created their history, then this was the past. But for me, as somebody who was going to be a writer, anywhere that I could see the nuts and bolts fascinated me. Anywhere that I could see how things were done, that things were done by people. I was absolutely fascinated by Harlan Ellison, a wonderful writer, talking about writing short stories in shop windows. He would do a sort of a stunt where he'd go to a bookshop, normally a science fiction fantasy bookshop in London or Paris, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and he would set up in the shop window and he'd be roped off so nobody could talk to him. He'd have his typewriter, and if you bought more than, I think it was like $100 worth of books, you could put a word or a title or a suggestion or just something in, you'd write it out and it would go onto his table and he'd look down and he'd include it in what he was doing. And Harlan said that he did it to try and demonstrate that writing was a craft, not magic. That it was actually something that you did, and you did it by sitting down, in his case at a typewriter, and you did it. And I loved that idea.
Well, of course, I mean, it's a very big leap, but a very small step in many ways, when you go from thinking, this is all magic and only available to people who are on the top of Parnassus. There are mysteries involved here, and this is a cult to which I can never get entry, as opposed to when you're at Fairleigh Dickinson and David Grant or David Daniel says to you, no, we're going to put words in front of each other, and if you practice at this, you'll get better.
And people are always faintly disappointed, though, when you tell them that, because what people really want to hear is the secret. They want the mystery, they want the secret, they want to know.
That's why those books sell so many copies. But
they don't even want those. What they want is to know that at midnight, if you've done the right things, there will be a bang 3 times on your door and you don't answer it. And then you wait 5 minutes, there will become another bang on your door, and this time you go and answer it, and Stephen King and J.K. Rowling and George R.R. Martin will be standing there, and they will be wearing grey robes. And they will take you down into the basement. And you will do the thing that is needful with the goat bones. And then you will be a novelist, and you will have the wisdom. And that's what they want to know.
So when you think back, I want to write comics, but because graphic novels isn't even a term yet to dignify comics. I want to write comics, but I want to write them. I want to write them, so I'm going to need to hook up with an artist. When you think about that and that moment, what was 2 questions? What was the comic that made you go, I could do that? And what was the first comic you read where you went, oh my God, someone else is doing that?
Okay, I can answer all of those questions. The first comics that made me go, I have to do that, I would have been in my early teens and maybe 14. I'm liking comics very much, and I went up to buy some comics in London from a basement comic shop that only opened on Saturdays, and they had something that I didn't know what it was called The Spirit, and published by Harvey Comics, and I bought it, and I had no idea that these were reprints from the early 1940s. All I knew was that these were 7-page comics, drawn and written as well as anything, and really thought out, and they had the power and impact of O. Henry short stories. And I looked at that and thought, okay, everything that I kind of thought you could do, you can obviously do. And I assumed that Will Eisner, who was doing it, was just a current guy, and this was this weird comic. I had no, they didn't publish, they didn't put a thing saying, this story first published in 1941. Right. So suddenly I got a chunk of history. Probably the comic that actually would have thrown me into my career, I have no idea what it was, but I remember the letter column, because there was some comic that I read when I was about 16 or 17, and somebody had asked the question, where do writers come from for comics? And the reply was, they come from all sorts of other fields, and it was a guy, Dennis O'Neill was the editor, and he was replying, he said, I used to be a journalist. And I thought, okay, you can get to comics by being a journalist, that's useful information. I'd already failed completely at finding out anything at all about comics by going through the school careers system. Because my school, they'd done this whole thing where you got a 2-day careers-based thing. And day 1 we all took tests. And then day 2 you were shown in, and everybody would go in and they would talk to a specialist careers advisor. And they'd be in there for 20, 25, 30 minutes, and they would come out normally holding pamphlets and knowing that they were going to be hotel administrators or join the Air Force or whatever. And I remember getting in line and waiting a long time and going in, sitting down. Test results, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to write American comics. And he looked at me as if I'd said, I want to rob graves. It was that kind of just sort of look, and there was a long pause. And then he said, but how do you go about doing that? I said, I have no idea. You are the careers officer. And then we sat and we stared at each other for another minute or two. And then he said, have you ever thought about accountancy? And I said, I have never thought about accountancy. And then it got silent again, and we sat there, and then I said, shall I show the next person in? And he said, why don't you? So that was my career's
That's
advice.
your career's advice, yeah.
But from that comic, I knew that you could get there by journalism. That was what I did. Then I was on Victoria Station in London in late 1983. I would have been 22 years old, and I picked up, and I'd stopped reading American comics pretty much when I was about 17 anyway. There wasn't anything I was interested in. I was still interested in what people like Will Eisner or Jules Pfeiffer were doing. I was buying, by this time I knew that the Eisner stuff was reprints in the 40s, and I was still buying reprints. But I remember thumbing through a pile of comics and coming to an Alan Moore Swamp Thing and reading it. And then putting it back because I hadn't bought a comic, an American comic, since I was for 6 years. And then 3 weeks later, being there, and there was a new one, and I read this one. And this time I bought it. And I read it. And I went, you know, all of that stuff that I thought you could do, the idea that you could do comics that would have as much depth and intellectual weight as films, as plays, as novels, as short stories. Somebody seems to have that idea, somebody's doing that, and now I really want to do it. You know, I kind of given up on the idea.
Exciting moment.
And it really was.
Yeah.
I remember I made contact with Alan. I sent him a copy of my first book, which was called Ghastly Beyond Belief. That was a collection of quotes from dreadful film and TV things. And books. Actually, Kim Newman, who I did it with, Kim did the film and TV stuff. I did the quotes, awful quotes from books. Which meant that I got to read all of the worst books in the world and find the worst quotes from them. My favorite was a novelist, if you will call him that, called Guy N. Smith, who wrote a book called Night of the Crabs, about 50-foot high crabs coming out of the ocean of Brighton and killing people. And it contained lines that I said I will never forget. Lines like, what a beautiful night it would be, he thought, as he sat by the barbed wire fence that surrounded the war memorial, if it were not for the threat of giant crabs. And my other favourite line was just, he wasn't going to leave Pat Benson alone that night, crabs or no crabs. So I sent Alan a copy of this book, and he phoned me up and said, you know, I lost a day's work because of you, mate. And we arranged to meet at a convention in Birmingham, and he handed me some pages, a couple of photocopied issues of something, and I said, what is it? And he said, it's this thing called Watchmen I'm doing here, take a look. And there weren't even any rumours of this, so I'm sitting there reading it in black and white, and read, I think, the first 2 issues of Watchmen, and thought, everything's changed. You really can do this stuff. And I buttonholed Alan, and I said, okay, you have to show me what a comic script looks like. I don't know. I know how to write a movie script, I know how to write a novel, I know how to write these things. I don't know. How do you get the thing out of your head? And so he just showed me. He sat there, grabbed a notebook, you know, page 1, panel 1. This is everything that's happening. You write it all down. This is, if you want somebody to think something, you put brackets, thinks, you know. And so I took that away.
Just appeared on the line.
And so I would, you know, I wrote a couple of comic scripts and sent them to Alan, who looked at them and said, yeah, they're really good. And then it got into a sort of weird and magical period of peculiar luck. Although I think that you kind of make your own luck. in some ways. Sitting next to her, being introduced to somebody in a pub. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a journalist. What do you do?" And he said, "I write comics." And I said, "I've always wanted to write comics." And I got a phone call from him 3 or 4 days later, saying, "You know, were you serious?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Great, I'm starting a comic." So I went along for some meetings for his comic. Dave McKean had been recruited, and he was working on some other stuff. A guy called Paul Gravett from Escape magazine came to look at this comic that was happening, and liked what I was writing, liked what Dave was drawing, asked if we'd do something together for Escape. We came back to him and said, would you mind if it wasn't a 5-page strip, but an original 48-page graphic novel called Violent Cases? And Paul Gravett, bless his heart, said, "No, do it."
Wow.
And so we went off and did it. Eddie Campbell, who is a marvelous artist, who apart from anything else, famous for doing From Hell with Alan Moore, and recently did my own Truth is a Cave in the Black Mountains, illustrated that, and was on stage with me at the Carnegie Hall with a string quartet. I read it with Eddie's illustrations being projected behind me, although not being drawn in real time. Frankly, you score on that. If we got Eddie drawn in real time at Carnegie Hall, it would be brilliant. Eddie calls Paul Gravett the man at the crossroads, because he says that everything that happened that was important in comics in the UK from like 1980 until 2000, Paul was always there somewhere, making it happen. And even now, last time I was in the UK, I went to a giant comics exhibit at the British Library, and it was like they'd finally won. It was the ultimate comics and graphic novels exhibition, taken over one floor of the British Library. You went there, and this was considered as important, as respectable, as much part of the mainstream as their Lewis Carroll manuscripts, as any of the things they have. And of course, they're sitting just a little bit in the background, having organised it all, was Paul Gravett.
But he is not, just to be clear, he's not a writer or a designer, a drawer. He's a publisher.
He's a facilitator. He's a curator.
Yeah.
Expert.
So let's go forward just a little bit. When you think of your 3 or 4, like there's a lot of people here today, and they, I'm sure, all have their, favourite things. What are the? Let's just say what you consider to be your 3 works that might have appealed most to people, and we'll just have a little show of hands for each one. Which one, you know what I mean? If you could, so think of the 3 that you think about, and then say them one by one, and we'll have a little show of hands if you can claim that as your own thing and the reason you're here. See what I'm doing? Okay, let's just do it quickly. Say the first one.
American Gods.
Okay.
Doctor Who.
So interesting. Go on.
Coraline.
How about Sandman?
Yep.
Interesting.
And what I love is, and I can keep going, there's...
It's all right.
What I was going to say is, what's interesting about that is, in 5 years, in 10 years, that would have changed too.
Yeah.
There would have been Hands for Stardust, there would have been Hands for the Graveyard Book, there would have been Hands for Neverwhere. But fewer hands for the Graveyard Book, whereas in 4 or 5 years from now, more people will have found that when they were 11, and it will have ruined their heads.
To me, growing up when we roughly, we grew up at the same time more or less, and to see people over here raising their hands for Doctor Who, I'm hazy on how. I know you've written 2 episodes of it, 2, right? That is amazing to me, that amongst your most influential work to some American students in the year 2014 would be 2 Doctor Who scripts. Does that blow your mind a little bit?
It just demonstrates that we are A, living in the future, and B, we won.
We're talking about Britain. And so, because I would, for me, it'd be Sandman, probably. Do you, what's it like?
I mean, the weird thing for Sandman, though, is Sandman, there are people of a certain age range who were around when Sandman was being published, and they read it as one thing on a monthly basis. There were people who then have discovered it through different ways in different collections. Now there's the real weirdness for me of doing signings at which people who were not born when the first Sandmans, in fact most of the people here were not born when the first Sandman came out, are there with proud parents who introduced them to Sandman in their teens. It's like, son, I think you're old enough.
Ever embarked on a project, any of your comic projects, and perhaps Sandman is the answer, which had no end, potentially? Like when people do a TV series in America, and they don't, they hope that it's going to go on forever. And whereas in England, the logic with TV series is 6 episodes, and, that's all, 2 series of Faulty Towers, and that's all you're ever going to get.
No, I don't think. I mean, somebody could possibly point to something I've done and say, look, that one. But mostly, when I think of things, for me, the process of creating a story is one in which the end gives everything meaning.
Right. Sure.
If it doesn't end, it doesn't mean anything. So, which I've taken to bizarre extremes in my career, in that I got to write the last Batman story, which is mad, because Batman does never end, and can't ever end. And when they said to me, would you like to write, a Batman 2-parter that will be the last Batman story ever?
Right.
I was like, oh, that is a bit mad, but yeah, and I'm trying to write a Batman story that would somehow allow, at that point, about 80 years of Batman stories to mean a little bit more was the challenge.
Yeah.
That was the delight.
It seems to me you said earlier that you never thought you would be a fantasy writer. And it seems to me that in a certain sense that you obviously are a fantasy writer, that because of the way you think, and I'm just putting something forth here, not something, because the way you think, it doesn't necessarily feel to you like you are writing fantasy writing, that it's the way your brain is kind of hardwired, is a phrase people use.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the bit...
I mean, to me, I read it and I go, oh, this is fantasy. But to you, I don't think it feels like a crazy world, as it were.
For me, partly I think it's just... People would really like a good origin story. Why do you write what you write? And I would say, well, when I was 4 years old, I was bitten by a radioactive myth. Now we understand everything. And people don't really come with origin stories, but the truth is that part of it is just, this is how my head is put together. If you put me and Stephen King and John Grisham in front of the same lake and in front of the same little boathouse and at the edge, in the woods on the edge of a lake, John Grisham is going to look at it and decide that that is where the honourable young lawyer on the run from the mob has to go and stay. And Stephen King is going to put a honeymooning couple there, and when they go out onto the dock, the thing is going to come out of the lake and eat them. And I'm going to look at it, and then the little house is going to get up on chicken legs and wander off into the woods, because that's how my head works.
But, of course, that is how your head works, but, obviously there is an encyclopedic knowledge of myth, ancient and modern, in your work. I mean, a lot of it, like in American Gods, a lot of the fun is meeting the characters for the first time and going, which deities are these? I've got to work, you know, do I know these ones? Are they Egyptian? I really don't know enough about Egyptian ones, but you do. You know, and so that's got to come from a lifetime of reading and exploring what myths are, right?
That was one of the weirdest questions I ever got about American Gods was people would say, well, you know, how long did it take to research?
Right.
And I would say 40 years.
Right.
And they would say, well, did you do any specific research for American Gods? And I would say, absolutely. I kept having to find out the populations of American towns that they drive through.
Yeah.
And also Slavic gods. I wanted my Slavic gods in there and knew almost nothing about them, and then spent about 6 months researching everything I could find, and I was about, and you'd read these books, and then you read the sources they were based on, and you'd go, you guys have nothing. We have basically lists of names, and we have hypotheses, and we have tiny little bits of things that are left, but there really wasn't anything, which meant that I made stuff up, which now is in Wikipedia. And actually, and what is crazy is there's stuff that I made up that is in Wikipedia, and they can point to the sources to it. And because there are now books on myth published after 2001, where they take my stuff and they put it in, and the Wikipedia people go, well, we're not getting this from Gaiman, we're getting it from this book. I go, yeah, but it's published in 2003. They read, you know...
Well, you are writing myths.
I know,
and so
that's how they start.
In the great pool of myths, yeah, how did the other ones start? The same way. It was good, actually. You were very useful to me the other day, because my daughter, I said, she's 8 years old, and she came back on, and I said, do you know why you're off on Columbus Day? And she said, yeah, I do know. It's because it's the day, and I knew what she was just going to say, it's the day Columbus discovered America, but that's all old hat. She went, she's 8, she went, it's the day Columbus discovered. And I was able to then take her through a couple of early passages of American Gods, heavily censored.
Lie down in your arms.